Ladies and gentlemen, today, I want to take you into the dark world of organized crime, corruption, and violence. Our subject is Radovan Krejčíř, a man who started as a businessman in the Czech Republic, but soon became one of the most feared crime bosses in South Africa. His journey is a chilling tale of power, greed, and lawlessness. Radovan Krejčíř was born on November 4, 1968, in Czechoslovakia, a country that was undergoing significant political and economic changes during his early years. Growing up in a society transitioning from communism to capitalism, Krejčíř saw an opportunity to exploit the new economic freedoms that came with the fall of the Soviet influence. Initially, he projected the image of a legitimate businessman, engaging in various ventures, including real estate and investments. However, behind the scenes, he was involved in illicit financial activities, including tax fraud, money laundering, and large-scale embezzlement. By the 1990s, Krejčíř had already made a name for himself in the Czech underworld. He was known for using intimidation, bribery, and manipulation to expand his business empire. His rapid rise in wealth and power drew the attention of law enforcement authorities, who began investigating his financial dealings. He allegedly defrauded the Czech government and private investors of millions of dollars through deceptive business schemes. One of his most notorious scams involved securing bank loans using fake or exaggerated financial records, then moving the money offshore before authorities could trace it. As the authorities closed in, Krejčíř became more ruthless. He was linked to several high-profile fraud cases and was suspected of having connections with organized crime groups operating in Eastern Europe. His luxurious lifestyle, which included extravagant homes, expensive cars, and high-stakes gambling, was a testament to the vast amounts of money he was siphoning through illegal means. However, his lavish spending and growing influence made it impossible for him to stay under the radar for long. In 2005, Czech police launched an operation to arrest him at his villa in Prague. During the raid, Krejčíř managed to escape in a dramatic fashion, slipping through the hands of law enforcement. He fled the country, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin, unpaid debts, and ongoing criminal investigations. His escape was so well orchestrated that it raised suspicions of insider help, further highlighting his deep connections within law enforcement and political circles. With an international warrant for his arrest, Krejčíř went on the run, seeking refuge in various countries before ultimately landing in South Africa. His ability to evade capture for so long showcased not only his cunning intelligence, but also the extent of corruption that allowed him to move freely despite being one of the most wanted criminals in Europe. His arrival in South Africa marked the beginning of a new, even more dangerous chapter in his criminal career. Radovan Krejčíř's escape from the Czech Republic in 2005 was nothing short of a Hollywood-style thriller. By the early 2000s, Czech authorities had gathered extensive evidence linking him to financial crimes, including fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. His businesses, once seen as symbols of success, were exposed as fronts for his illegal dealings. The Czech government, under increasing pressure to crack down on corruption and organized crime, decided to take action against him. On June 18, 2005, law enforcement officers raided his luxurious villa in Černice, a wealthy suburb of Prague. This raid was part of a broader effort to arrest him and seize evidence of his criminal activities. However, what should have been a routine arrest turned into one of the most embarrassing security failures in Czech law enforcement history. As the police stormed his residence, Krejčíř pretended to cooperate. He calmly walked with officers into a separate room, under the pretext of retrieving certain documents. But in a shocking turn of events, he managed to slip away unnoticed. Reports suggest that he escaped through a bathroom window or a hidden passage in the villa, evading capture within minutes. By the time officers realized what had happened, he was already gone. His escape immediately raised suspicions of insider help. How could a high-profile criminal, under heavy police surveillance, manage to flee so effortlessly? Many believe that Krejčíř had bribed police officers or received advanced warnings about the raid. This theory was supported by the fact that several officers involved in the operation were later investigated for possible corruption. Once out of police custody, Krejčíř quickly went into hiding. He used his extensive criminal network to secure false identities and travel documents. Over the next few months, he moved between several countries, including the Seychelles, where he reportedly attempted to obtain citizenship. His ability to travel freely despite an international arrest warrant demonstrated his deep connections in the criminal underworld. As Czech authorities scrambled to locate him, Krejčíř was already plotting his next move. He knew that Europe was becoming too dangerous for him, as law enforcement agencies across the continent were on high alert. His decision to head to South Africa was strategic. He saw the country as a place where corruption and weak law enforcement could provide him with the protection he needed. In 2007, Krejčíř entered South Africa using a forged passport. Despite being an internationally wanted fugitive, he was able to slip through the country's immigration system undetected. He claimed asylum, portraying himself as a businessman fleeing political persecution. His arrival in South Africa marked the beginning of a new and even more dangerous phase in his criminal career. After escaping from the Czech Republic and evading capture across multiple countries, Radovan Krejčíř finally arrived in South Africa in 2007. His choice of destination was not random. South Africa, at the time, was known for its high levels of corruption within law enforcement and political institutions. This made it an ideal location for a fugitive looking to establish himself without immediate fear of extradition. Krejčíř entered the country using a false passport, slipping past immigration authorities with relative ease. Despite being an internationally wanted fugitive with an Interpol red notice against his name, he managed to exploit weaknesses in South Africa's immigration system. Soon after his arrival, he applied for asylum, claiming he was being persecuted in his home country. Shockingly, despite his criminal record and ongoing investigations, South African authorities did not immediately deport him. Instead, he was granted temporary legal status, allowing him to operate freely in the country. Upon settling in Johannesburg, Krejčíř quickly began establishing connections within South Africa's criminal underworld. Unlike other fugitives who might have kept a low profile, he did the opposite. He openly displayed his wealth and influence, living in a multi-million-dollar mansion in Bedfordview, an affluent suburb of Johannesburg. He drove luxury cars, threw extravagant parties, and surrounded himself with bodyguards, giving him the aura of an untouchable crime lord. His arrival in the country coincided with a period of rising organized crime activity, particularly within drug trafficking and money laundering networks. Krejčíř wasted no time in making his presence felt, forming alliances with powerful crime syndicates, including those involved in drug smuggling, illegal mining, and high-profile assassinations. He leveraged his experience from the Czech Republic, where he had already built a reputation for fraud and corruption, and applied the same tactics in South Africa. One of the key factors behind Krejčíř's rapid rise in South Africa was his ability to manipulate and corrupt law enforcement officials. He reportedly paid off police officers, government officials, and even members of the judiciary to ensure his protection. Several South African police officers were later investigated for their ties to him, with allegations that they had helped him avoid arrest, tipped him off about investigations, or even actively participated in his criminal enterprises. At the same time, Krejčíř was expanding his influence beyond just bribery. He was accused of orchestrating a series of violent attacks against rivals and business associates who refused to cooperate with him. Several individuals linked to him either disappeared or were found murdered under mysterious circumstances. Despite numerous allegations and suspicions, he continued to operate with near-total impunity, reinforcing the belief that he was too powerful to be brought down. His involvement in South Africa's underworld extended far beyond just financial crimes. He was also linked to large-scale drug trafficking operations, smuggling massive quantities of cocaine and heroin into and out of the country. Reports suggested that he worked closely with international drug cartels, using South Africa as a transit hub for narcotics destined for Europe and beyond. His ability to control these operations while maintaining his public image as a businessman showcased his skill in navigating the world of organized crime. As his wealth and power grew, so did his arrogance. He reportedly boasted about his ability to evade justice, and even mocked South African authorities for their inability to arrest him. He believed he was invincible, and for several years, it seemed as though he was. However, his growing notoriety eventually attracted the attention of both local and international law enforcement agencies, who began closely monitoring his activities. Krejčíř's arrival in South Africa marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would eventually spiral out of control. He had successfully infiltrated the country's criminal and political networks, building a powerful empire fueled by drug money, corruption, and violence. But as history has shown, no crime boss remains untouchable forever. Once Radovan Krejčíř had firmly established himself in South Africa, he wasted no time in expanding his criminal operations. One of his most lucrative ventures was drug trafficking, an industry that was already thriving in the country. Using his experience in organized crime from the Czech Republic and his connections with international cartels, he quickly became a key player in the illicit drug trade. South Africa, with its extensive coastline and weak border controls, was an ideal hub for smuggling narcotics. The country's ports and airports provided convenient routes for drug shipments, making it a gateway for trafficking to Europe, Australia, and other global markets. Krejčíř saw the potential in this trade and built strong alliances with local and international drug syndicates, allowing him to control large portions of the cocaine and heroin supply in the region. His drug empire operated on multiple levels. At the lower end, he controlled street-level distribution networks that ensured his products reached users across South Africa's cities. But his real focus was on large-scale shipments. He used corrupt officials within customs, law enforcement, and the judiciary to ensure that his drugs moved through ports and airports without detection. There were multiple reports of law enforcement officers being bribed to look the other way while tons of narcotics were smuggled into the country. One of his biggest operations involved smuggling cocaine from South America into South Africa, where it was then repackaged and shipped to European markets. Krejčíř allegedly worked closely with South American cartels, acting as a middleman who facilitated the transportation and sale of the drugs. His access to vast financial resources allowed him to fund these large-scale operations, purchasing shipments in bulk and distributing them through his network of criminal associates. In addition to cocaine, Krejčíř's network was also heavily involved in heroin trafficking. Afghanistan's heroin trade had begun making its way into Africa, and South Africa became a key transit point. Krejčíř was believed to be instrumental in establishing routes that allowed heroin to move from East Africa to South Africa and then be shipped to international markets. His ability to coordinate these operations with criminal networks from multiple continents demonstrated his deep involvement in global organized crime. To maintain control over his drug empire, Krejčíř employed extreme violence. Anyone who posed a threat to his operations, whether a rival dealer, a disloyal associate, or an informant, was swiftly dealt with. Numerous individuals linked to the drug trade were either assassinated or disappeared under suspicious circumstances, with many suspecting that Krejčíř had personally ordered their executions. He had a reputation for ruthlessness, and those who crossed him rarely lived to tell the tale. One of the most infamous incidents linked to Krejčíř's drug empire was the murder of South African drug kingpin Cyril Bika in 2011. Bika was a well-known figure in the country's underworld and had extensive connections with both criminal syndicates and intelligence agencies. He was assassinated in a drive-by shooting, and while Krejčíř denied involvement, many believe that he had orchestrated the hit to eliminate a rival and consolidate his power in the drug trade. Despite mounting evidence against him, Krejčíř continued to operate with near-complete impunity for years. His wealth and influence allowed him to bribe key officials and intimidate witnesses, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to build a case against him. However, his growing involvement in the drug trade did not go unnoticed, and both local and international authorities began increasing their efforts to bring him down. Krejčíř's drug trafficking empire was a major factor in the surge of organized crime in South Africa during his reign. His operations not only fueled the local drug crisis, but also contributed to an increase in violent crime, as rival gangs fought for control of distribution networks. His ability to smuggle massive quantities of narcotics across international borders made him one of the most dangerous criminals in South Africa's history. However, as with many crime bosses before him, his unchecked rise to power would eventually lead to his downfall. Radovan Krejčíř's ability to operate as a crime boss in South Africa was not just due to his involvement in drug trafficking, but also his mastery of money laundering and deep-rooted corruption. His criminal empire was fueled by vast sums of illicit money, and to avoid detection, he had to find ways to make his dirty money appear legitimate. To achieve this, he created an extensive network of front businesses, shell companies, and corrupt officials who helped him move his wealth without raising suspicion. Money laundering was a crucial part of Krejčíř's operation. His businesses ranged from real estate investments to luxury car dealerships, nightclubs, and import-export companies, many of which were merely fronts to disguise the movement of illegal funds. One of his most effective tactics was buying high-value properties and reselling them through fraudulent transactions, inflating prices to create the illusion of legitimate profits. He also invested in high-end vehicles, artwork, and even gold, using these assets to launder money while enjoying a lavish lifestyle. To further obscure his financial dealings, Krejčíř relied on offshore accounts and international banking networks. He allegedly moved large sums of money through accounts in tax havens such as the Seychelles, Dubai, and Mauritius, making it difficult for authorities to track his wealth. Radovan Krejčíř was not just a businessman running illicit enterprises. He was also a ruthless enforcer who used extreme violence to eliminate threats. As his power and influence grew in South Africa, so did the number of his enemies. Rivals in the drug trade, former associates who betrayed him, and even law enforcement officials who attempted to bring him down. Many of them ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. Assassinations became one of his most feared tactics, allowing him to tighten his grip on South Africa's criminal underworld. Krejčíř's rise in organized crime was marked by a trail of bodies. Many of his enemies were eliminated in broad daylight, often through professional hitmen skilled in carrying out targeted killings. One of the most high-profile murders linked to him was the assassination of South African underworld figure Cyril Bika in 2011. Bika was a well-connected figure in the country's intelligence and crime circles, and his killing sent shockwaves through both the criminal and law enforcement communities. Although Krejčíř denied involvement, many believe that he had ordered the hit to remove a potential threat. His assassination tactics were methodical and brutal. Victims were often gunned down in public places, executed in drive-by shootings, or simply made to disappear. In some cases, bodies were never found, fueling speculation that Krejčíř's network had access to secret disposal methods. One of the most terrifying aspects of his operations was the way in which his enemies seemed to vanish without a trace. Some who opposed him would suddenly leave the country or go into hiding, fearing that they would be next. One chilling example of his ruthlessness was the attempted murder of businessman and former associate Lolly Jackson, the owner of the Teasers strip club chain. Jackson was found murdered in 2010, and while Krejčíř was not formally charged, his name was frequently mentioned in connection with the case. Jackson had been involved in money laundering and other illegal dealings, and it was widely believed that he had fallen out with Krejčíř over financial disputes. His death sent a clear message. Those who betrayed or opposed Krejčíř would pay with their lives. Another high-profile case linked to Krejčíř was the torture and murder of Lebanese businessman Bassam Issa. Issa had allegedly owed Krejčíř a large sum of money, and when he failed to repay it, he was kidnapped and subjected to brutal torture. According to reports, Krejčíř personally oversaw the torture session, demanding that Issa pay back the debt. When Issa could not produce the money, he was executed. This case became one of the key pieces of evidence in the eventual criminal charges against Krejčíř, as investigators uncovered shocking details of his involvement in the murder. Beyond personal disputes, Krejčíř also ordered hits on law enforcement officers and government officials who attempted to investigate him. South African police officers and prosecutors working on cases against him often found themselves under threat. Some were reportedly offered large bribes to drop investigations, while others received death threats. Those who refused to comply faced assassination attempts. Several members of law enforcement involved in cases against him were attacked, and at least one prosecutor narrowly survived a car bomb attempt. Krejčíř's ability to carry out assassinations without immediate consequences demonstrated the extent of his control over corrupt elements within the police and judicial system. Many of his hits went unsolved for years, as investigators either feared retaliation or were bribed to look the other way. This created an atmosphere of fear, where even high-ranking officials hesitated to take action against him. As his list of enemies grew, so did the violence. Shootouts between his men and rival gangs became more frequent, and Johannesburg's criminal landscape turned increasingly chaotic. Under his reign, targeted assassinations became a common method of settling disputes, and his reputation as an untouchable crime boss only strengthened. His ability to order and execute high-profile killings with impunity made him one of the most feared criminals in South Africa's history. As Radovan Krejčíř's criminal empire expanded in South Africa, he inevitably attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies. While he had managed to operate with near impunity for years, thanks to his extensive network of corrupt officials and powerful criminal connections, the authorities were becoming increasingly determined to bring him down. His open flaunting of wealth, involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering, and a string of high-profile assassinations made him a priority target for South African police and international law enforcement agencies. Despite numerous allegations against him, Krejčíř was a master at evading justice. He employed multiple tactics to stay ahead of the authorities, including bribing police officers, intimidating witnesses, and using legal loopholes to delay or dismiss charges. He also surrounded himself with a private security team, consisting of heavily armed bodyguards, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to arrest him without the risk of a violent confrontation. His Bedford View mansion in Johannesburg was fortified like a fortress, equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance systems, security gates, and escape routes in case of a raid. One of the earliest and most dramatic clashes between Krejčíř and South African law enforcement occurred in 2013 when police attempted to arrest him on charges of attempted murder, kidnapping, and drug-related offenses. The arrest operation was conducted with military-style precision, involving heavily armed police units and special task force members. However, even in the face of overwhelming force, Krejčíř resisted arrest. Reports suggest that he attempted to negotiate with officers on the spot, offering them large sums of money in exchange for his freedom. In another instance, Krejčíř was implicated in a plot to assassinate forensic investigator Paul O'Sullivan, who had been actively gathering evidence against him. O'Sullivan had played a crucial role in exposing Krejčíř's connections to corrupt police officers and his involvement in organized crime. The assassination plot was foiled by authorities, further strengthening the case against Krejčíř. O'Sullivan's persistence, along with international pressure, forced South African authorities to increase their efforts to dismantle Krejčíř's criminal operations. Despite these setbacks, Krejčíř continued to operate with a sense of impunity. He openly mocked law enforcement, at times even taunting officers who failed to arrest him. In one shocking incident, he was allegedly involved in a staged police raid on his own property. According to reports, he had bribed corrupt officers to fake an arrest so that he could later claim harassment and use it as leverage in his legal battles. This bold maneuver showcased his ability to manipulate the system to his advantage. His influence within law enforcement circles was further exposed when several high-ranking police officers were found to be on his payroll. Investigations revealed that some officers had provided him with classified information, warned him about impending arrests, and even assisted in covering up his crimes. This widespread corruption made it incredibly difficult for authorities to build a solid case against him, as every move they made was seemingly countered by insiders working for Krejčíř. Despite multiple arrest attempts, Krejčíř always seemed to find a way to walk free. Either the charges against him would mysteriously disappear, or key witnesses would withdraw their statements under suspicious circumstances. Some witnesses who were set to testify against him were found dead before they could take the stand, further complicating the prosecution's efforts. His ability to manipulate the legal system left investigators frustrated, as every attempt to convict him was met with obstacles. However, as international pressure mounted and his list of enemies grew longer, Krejčíř began to lose the invincibility he once enjoyed. International agencies, including Interpol and Czech authorities, intensified their efforts to have him extradited. With more evidence piling up, including phone recordings, bank statements, and witness testimonies, the walls around him started closing in. Eventually, law enforcement agencies had no choice but to strike harder, launching a full-scale crackdown on Krejčíř's operations. Multiple raids were conducted on his properties, resulting in the seizure of assets, weapons, and financial records linking him to organized crime. As he faced increasing pressure from both law enforcement and rival criminal organizations, Krejčíř's empire began to crumble. For years, Radovan Krejčíř operated with near-total impunity, skillfully avoiding justice through a combination of corruption, intimidation, and manipulation. However, even the most powerful criminals eventually faced their reckoning. As the pressure from both South African and international authorities intensified, cracks began to form in Krejčíř's once unshakable empire. His arrogance, which had once been his greatest weapon, ultimately contributed to his downfall. The turning point in Krejčíř's reign came when law enforcement agencies, both local and international, coordinated their efforts to take him down. Unlike previous attempts, where corrupt officials had leaked information and compromised investigations, this time authorities moved swiftly and secretly. A series of high-profile arrests of his associates weakened his operations, cutting off crucial lines of communication and financial support. Many of his closest allies, fearing for their own safety, turned against him, providing law enforcement with vital evidence of his crimes. One of the key factors leading to his downfall was his involvement in a botched kidnapping and attempted murder case. Krejčíř had orchestrated the abduction of Becky Lukiel, the brother of a suspected drug dealer who had allegedly stolen a large shipment of crystal meth from him. Lukiel was taken to Krejčíř's house, where he was tortured for hours as Krejčíř demanded the return of the stolen drugs. The victim's harrowing testimony, along with overwhelming forensic evidence, became a cornerstone in the prosecution's case against Krejčíř. With this case, South African law enforcement finally had a strong enough legal argument to detain Krejčíř and begin formal proceedings against him. In 2013, after years of evading justice, he was finally arrested in a high-security police operation. Unlike previous arrests, where he had either managed to bribe his way out or intimidate witnesses into silence, this time the charges against him were far too serious to be dismissed. As his trial progressed, the evidence against Krejčíř continued to mount. Prosecutors presented a detailed web of criminal activity, including drug trafficking, money laundering, tax fraud, and orchestrating multiple assassinations. Testimonies from former allies, business partners, and even corrupt police officers who had worked with him painted a damning picture of his role in South Africa's underworld. For the first time, it became clear that his empire had been built on layers of deceit, violence, and corruption. During the trial, Krejčíř continued to maintain his innocence, often displaying the same arrogance that had defined his criminal career. He attempted to portray himself as a victim of political persecution, claiming that authorities were targeting him unfairly. However, the sheer weight of evidence left little room for doubt. His legal team used every possible tactic to delay proceedings, filing numerous appeals and procedural challenges, but these efforts only prolonged the inevitable. As international authorities continued their investigations, additional charges were brought against him in his home country of the Czech Republic. Czech officials had been seeking his extradition for years, accusing him of large-scale fraud, money laundering, and involvement in multiple murder plots. With both South African and Czech authorities determined to see justice served, it became clear that Krejčíř would not escape punishment this time. In 2015, after a lengthy trial, Radovan Krejčíř was convicted of multiple charges, including kidnapping, attempted murder, and drug-related offenses. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison, marking the official end of his reign as one of South Africa's most feared crime lords. His conviction sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, signaling that even the most powerful figures were not beyond the reach of justice. Following his sentencing in South Africa, discussions about his extradition to the Czech Republic began. Czech authorities were determined to see him face justice for his crimes in his home country, where he had orchestrated massive fraud schemes and was implicated in multiple murder plots. However, logistical and legal challenges complicated the extradition process, with Krejčíř's legal team fighting to prevent his transfer. Despite being locked behind bars, Krejčíř remained a significant figure in the criminal world. Reports surfaced that he was still attempting to exert influence from prison, using intermediaries to coordinate operations outside. Authorities took extreme measures to isolate him, transferring him to a high-security prison to prevent him from continuing his criminal activities. His incarceration marked a rare victory for law enforcement, demonstrating that no criminal, no matter how powerful, could remain untouchable forever. Radovan Krejčíř's story is a chilling reminder of how corruption, power, and violence can allow criminals to thrive, even in the face of law enforcement. For years, he evaded justice, leaving behind a trail of destruction, from drug networks to assassinations. However, no empire built on crime lasts forever. His eventual downfall and imprisonment prove that even the most elusive and feared criminals are not immune to the law. Today, Krejčíř sits behind bars, stripped of his wealth, power, and influence. His conviction serves as a testament to the persistence of justice and the tireless efforts of those who refuse to be intimidated by his reign of terror. While his story remains a dark chapter in both Czech and South African criminal history, it also stands as a warning. Crime may offer temporary power, but ultimately, justice prevails.